this grid chart, whatever you want to call it, is going to be super important for you over the next week and a half. Okay? Whatever you don't have that I write down, you need to make sure you fill in. So can someone tell me one of the 4 ways to solve quadratic equations? Noah. Quadratic formula. Okay, it doesn't matter what box you have that written in, but that is the last way that we solved, so that one should be the most fresh on your mind. Joseph, can you give me a different one?
Completing the square.
Okay. Go ahead, Natalie.
Solving by taking square roots.
Taking square roots. And last but not least, anyone else? Factoring. Whoops. Okay, so those are the 4 ways you should have written on your paper. If you don't have those 4 ways, you need to do that now. Let's start with factoring because that was the first thing we learned. What's important, do you think, about factoring? Okay, GCF. We need to look for GCF first. Absolutely. If that works, great. If it doesn't work, we have another option. What's that option? Okay, so we have GCF and we have the super X. So let's draw a super X and fill in the information that we need for it. What goes in the top of the super X?
A times C.
A times C. On the bottom is B. Top here? AX, or A in your variable. And then these bottom 2 pieces are your factors. And those are numbers that multiply to A times C and add to B. So multiply to that top number and add to the bottom number. Is there anything else that's important about factoring?
Oh, the use of brace, don't you need a x squared for A needs to be your highest exponent.
Okay, so your highest exponent is a 2. Yep, it's a quadratic. What else? Think about the form of your equation. What does it have to be? Standard form. So ax squared plus bx plus c. Anything else important if I'm going to solve? Equals 0. So in order to factor, it has to be in standard form. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, so you'll look for GCF. If it works, great. If it doesn't, super X. But it has to be in that form. Are we okay with that? What was the second thing we learned? Taking square roots. Okay, anything important about taking square roots?
Always have 2 answers.
You have 2 answers. Remember, you need a plus minus.
Standard form.
Like it's going to be written like this for taking square roots. If you look back at your notes, and I believe it's pages 34 to 38. So take a second. I want you to flip to pages 34 to 38, and I want you to look at all of the equations we've used for taking square roots. Is there anything that you notice? I want every single person to flip back in their notes and look at the equations. Is there anything you notice about the equations for taking square roots? Joseph? Okay, your highest exponent's 2. All of them will be, because we're solving quadratics, and quadratics have the highest exponent is a 2. Is there anything else you notice? Here are maybe some examples of different equations you might see. Is there anything you notice about all of those equations?
They're all equal to something?
Okay, anything else?
All squared?
They all have an exponent of 2. Yep, we've already said that. Something else super important, and if you can identify this one thing, it will help you identify when you're going to take square roots. Look at all 4 of those equations. What do you notice about all of them? Javon? Okay. Kind of.
Isn't that there's no B?
There is no BX term. Super important. There is no. So if you look at every single one of the equations, there's an x squared term, there's a constant, but you have no BX term. If you don't have the B term, you're going to use taking square roots. It's the easiest thing. Okay, super, super important there. This is a big one. It will help you when we're solving. What did we do after taking square roots? Completing the square. Okay. What's important about completing the square?
AX squared plus BX plus blank equals constant plus blank. And also B over 2 in parentheses second power equals C.
Okay. It fills in that blank for you, right? So you should have AX squared plus BX plus something equals C plus something, and then you're going to fill in that blank with B over 2 squared. Absolutely. Is there anything else that's really important about completing the square?
Factors will always be the same.
The what?
The factors will always be the same.
Okay, so before you actually square it, that's going to be your factor. So you factor the left, right? Factor the left once you fill it in, and simplify the right. There's something else that's super important. Anyone remember anything else? Let me grab my notebook. I can tell you what page it's on. If we look back on page, a little bit on 42 and then 44. 42 and 44. What do you notice that's important on those 2 pages? Look back at page 42 and 44. Noah?
I think the C is always positive.
Yep. That blank that you fill in, it is always positive. Yeah, we can add that. The blank is always positive. Anything else?
2 answers.
Okay, you'll have 2 answers.
A equals 1.
A needs to equal 1. Super important. So if you look back at page 44, for instance, you'll notice that my A value is not 1, and that's where we had to divide through. You cannot use completing the square unless A equals 1. And then last but not least, the most recent was the quadratic formula. What can you tell me about the quadratic formula?
Standard form.
Okay, so it needs to be in standard form. So AX squared plus BX plus C equals 0. Joseph?
It needs to be, it always works.
It will always work. I left a big space. What do you think I left that for? The formula. What is it?
X equals
X equals-
C squared, root of B squared minus 4AC, all over 2A.
See?
I was thinking that during spring break. Okay.
Now you're not going to forget it. So negative B plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4AC all over 2A. Anything else you think we need to add? You guys came up with some other things that second period didn't necessarily come up with. Okay, again, this is going to be your lifeline for the next week. So just kind of a heads up of what's going to happen. Today we're going to look at all 4 of these where you get to choose your own method. So I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to give you some hints about how we can choose, but you're going to choose your own method on actually how to solve. On Monday, you will take a quiz. On Thursday, you will take a test, next Thursday. Okay? None of the information that we're going over is new. We factored, we've taken square roots, we've completed the square, and we've used the quadratic formula. Now it's just you have to decide which one you're going to do. Worst case, which one do you use? Quadratic formula. If you're like, I have no idea, or I can't decide which one I want to use the quadratic formula. Now, you're not going to want to do that if I give you 20 problems because you remember how long it takes, right? Which is why we use some of the other methods. But you know that it's always going to work for you. Okay? If I were you, I would keep your notebook like flat so that you can use this page as a reference right now as we go through. But again, you do you. So solving quadratics. Choose your method. What? No, we are. Here we go. Your directions for all of this will say choose a method and solve. The important part here is solve. What does it mean to solve? Find the answer. If you were explaining it to someone who like wasn't in our class and didn't know what that meant, what else could you add to that? Like, what does it mean?
Solve for the variable.
Solve for the variable. Get an answer for the variable. Okay, that's what our goal is. Now, all of these theoretically have two answers. Sometimes they're whole numbers or fractions. Sometimes they include square roots. Okay, so none of that's changing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give us a problem. M squared plus M equals 12. Now I want you to look at your chart. And remember, you can rewrite the equation any way you need to. But I want you to look at your chart and determine which way do you think would be the best way to solve this equation. You have 4 options. Joseph has his hand up first, so we're going to go with Joseph's option.
I would subtract 12 from both sides instead of equal to 0.
So what method are you going to use?
I think that's completing the square.
Okay, so pick a method. Which method do we want to use?
We want to use the square root.
Okay. Can you take square roots with this problem? Why? No. So in this case, we cannot take square roots because there's a b term. Remember, here, there is no b term for square. Oops, you can't see that. There is no b term for square roots. So that's really the only one I can't choose from. So let's choose a different option. Completing the square. Great. I'm so glad you said that. Okay, so let's complete the square. Is that in the form that I need it to be in? No. I'm missing the blanks, right? So let's go with that. So m squared plus m plus something equals 12 plus something. Right?
Yeah.
And how do I fill in those blanks? B divided by 2 squared. What is B? 1. 1 divided by 2 squared. Can I simplify 1 over 2? No, so I'm just going to square it. What's 1 squared? What's 2 squared? 4. So I have to add 1/4 to both sides. You just chose a method that involves fractions. Here we go. Okay. What did we do to the left-hand side? If you look at your box, what do we do to the left?
Factor.
Factor the left. And remember, your factor is what you have right before you square it. So you should have m plus 1/2 squared equals. Now I need to add 12 and 1/4. Yes, Joseph.
Didn't you say like the 1/4 is gonna be our whatchamacallit anyway? You said that when we solve that b over 2, the factor that we get for our final answer is the one that we use for the... So we use 1/4?
No, you use 1/2 because this is your final answer.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Okay, do we know how to add 12 and 1/4? So that's really 12 over 1 plus 1 over 4. How do I add fractions? Common denominator. So what's my common denominator going to be? 4. It's what I can turn both of them into. This one's already a 4, but I can make this one a 4. Whatever you do to the top, you have to do to the bottom. Does this look familiar? Okay. I'm going to show you why this may not have been the best option, but it'll work. So if I have this fraction, I have 48 over 4 plus 1 over 4. Once you have a common denominator, you add the numerator. So everyone should be writing this down. I want you to have this on your paper. 48 plus 1 is 49 over 4. Okay, so right now, really all we've done is add the fractions together. How do I continue this problem? How do we solve? Take the square root. So when you take the square root, you have m plus 1/2 equals plus or minus 7/2. Because the square root of 49 is 7, the square root of 4 is 2. Is m by itself? No. Nope, so I'm going to keep going. I'm going to subtract 1/2. And here we'll have two physical answers because there's no square root left. So I have a 7/2 minus 1/2 and a negative 7/2 minus 1/2. The nice thing is the denominator is the same, so it's just a matter of adding the numerators. What's 7 minus 1? 6, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. Negative 7 minus 1 is negative 8. Divided by 2 is negative 4. So m equals 3, m equals negative 4. I can use completing the square. Did you like that? No. Probably not, right? That hurt your brain because of the fractions. So I will give you a hint. Well, it's not even a hint. I personally use completing the square as my absolute last resort. My favorite thing to use, if at all possible, is factoring. I know I'm good at factoring. Could I solve that problem by factoring? What would I need to do to solve it by factoring? Subtract 12. So m squared plus m minus 12 equals 0. Is there a GCF?
No.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Super X. What is A?
1.
What is B?
1.
What is C?
Negative 12.
Great. So on top is A times C. Again, you should be writing this down. On bottom is B. And then I have a 1m and a 1m. I'm looking for two numbers. Yes, Lauren.
How'd you get negative 12?
I subtracted 12 from both sides. You were good? Okay, sorry. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add to 1.
4 times negative 3.
4 and negative 3. Let's check. 4 times negative 3 is negative 12. 4 minus 3 is 1. Now, before I can solve, remember you have to write it in factored form. So m plus 4 and m minus 3 equals 0. Remember factored form? Okay. M plus 4 equals 0. M minus 3 equals 0. So what does m equal? Negative 4 and positive 3. Isn't that the answer that I got from completing the square? Because it will be. What other method could I use? We're not going to do it, but what other method could I use? Quadratic formula. And if you don't know which method to use, go with the quadratic formula because you know it's going to work.
So whenever we use factoring, we have to solve, not just factoring.
Correct. So all of these are going to be solving. Okay? Remember when we were factoring, you got a possible answer of not factorable? Mm-hmm. That means that there's an imaginary number, which we talked about and we'll talk more about later in the week, or there's a square root in your answer, and so you can't factor that, which means you have to then look at completing the square or quadratic formula. There will be 0 answers on your test that say not factorable. People are, even though I say that every time, people are still typing in not factorable. Not one single answer will be not factorable. Can you not factor? Maybe, but you have other options. Okay? So your goal is to try to find the best option so your brain doesn't hurt after dealing with fractions. Okay? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a problem. With your group, I want you to decide what is the best way to solve it and why. So, what is the best way to solve that problem and why? Look at your chart, talk with your group. I'm coming around to ask every single group. So decide what is the best way to solve and why. Okay, so to take square roots, I'm going to add 10 to both sides. So 2x squared equals 26. You have to get x squared by itself, so you're going to divide by 2. X squared equals 13. Now what? Take the square root. X equals plus or minus square root of 13. Can I simplify the square root of 13? Nope. So that's going to be your answer. Okay, so again, if there is no B term, automatically go to taking square roots. All right, why don't you try this one? So figure out the best method and solve. And again, if you can't figure it out, you're like, I have no idea what method to use, which one should you use? Quadratic formula. If you chose a method other than completing the square, you're going to get the same answer, but I'm going to do completing the square. So in order to do that, I have to add 7 to both sides, giving me x squared plus 2x plus something equals 3 plus something. And to fill in that blank, it's b divided by 2 squared, which is 1 squared, or just 1. What do I do to the left? What do we do to the left for completing the square? Okay, but what am I doing? Factoring. And it's x plus 1 squared. And on the right, we simplify. 3 plus 1 is 4. From there, I'm going to take square roots. So x plus 1 equals plus or minus 2. Subtract 1. And I have 2 physical answers, 2 minus 1 and negative 2 minus 1. X equals 1 and x equals negative 3. And again, whether you chose to factor or use the quadratic formula, this one would still work. So my recommendation to you is you choose a method that works best for you, but understand that it might not always work out as nicely. Okay? And there may be times where you can't factor and you have to use something else. All right, let's try, I think we can try this last one and then I'll give you homework. So 2x squared plus 8x minus 52 equals negative 10. Someone want to tell me what method they chose and why, Joseph?
I chose factoring because
It seemed like the easiest. Okay, so you chose factoring. What did you do first in order to factor?
I added 10 to both sides.
Okay, so you knew you had to write it in standard form and set it equal to 0. So that's the first step there. What makes you think, by looking at this, because I could also write it like this and use the quadratic formula, right? What, looking at this, makes you think, maybe I should try factoring? Is there anything that makes that stand out to you? So there's, what does that mean when you say divide by 2? It means there's a GCF. Remember when we did the quadratic formula, and you kept asking me, should I pull out this GCF? Should I pull out this GCF? And I said, no, don't worry about it right now. All of those problems would have been really good factoring problems. Okay, so I have to pull out my GCF first, which is a 2. So 2 comes out, leaving me with x squared plus 4x minus 21 equals 0. I can now use the super x. A times c on top. So 1 times negative 21 is negative 21. B's on the bottom. And I have a 1x and a 1x. Are there two numbers that multiply to negative 21 and add to 4? 7 and negative 3. I can't simplify those, so in factored form I have x plus 7 and x minus 3 equals 0. Question, do I need to worry about this 2? Okay, so I'm going to put that 2 there. What do I do from there?
You put the 2 equals, or set everything equals 0.
Okay. And what happens with 2 equals 0? So because I'm factoring and because there's not a variable next to that 2, because I'm solving and because there's not a variable next to that 2, I really don't need to worry about it because it's going to cancel out anyway. But that's okay. So x equals negative 7 and x equals positive 3. Quadratic formula would have worked. And completing the square would have worked as well. You just have to make sure you divide that 2 out of the front. Okay. Are we kind of understanding what we're doing? So no new information. You just have to choose the best method, which is why I kept having you practice factoring over and over and over again. So taking square roots should be your first option because it's the easiest, right? But if there's a B term, then you have the other 3 to choose from, and you decide which out of those 3 you like the best. Okay? And one more time, remember, if factoring doesn't work, like if you cannot factor it, you have to complete the square or you have to use the quadratic formula. You don't get to just give up. You have to do something else. Yeah.
I did completing the square, but I got a totally different answer.
Okay, so let's look at completing the square for this problem. I think that's a good idea, actually. So for completing the square, I would have done things slightly differently. What do I need to start by doing? I need to add the blanks and I need to add 52 to both sides, right? So it would be 2x squared plus 8x plus something equals 42 plus something. Do you have that?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. Now here's the problem with completing the square if you don't remember this step. This has to be a 1. So I need to divide everything by 2. Is that the step you missed? Okay. So x squared plus 4x plus something equals 21 plus something. So if you're going to complete the square, this number out front has to be a 1. Is it going to work nicely? Yeah. 4 divided by 2 squared is 2 squared, which is 4. Factor the left. X plus 2 squared equals 25. Take the square root. X plus 2 equals plus or minus 5. Subtract 2 and you have 2 answers. 3 and negative 7. Okay. So it works, you just have to make sure you do all the steps appropriately. Completing the square wasn't our best test, so unless you're really good at it, maybe that's not your best option. Any other questions? Okay.